The mist hadn't even cleared from the valley when the gravel at the end of Arthur Vance's driveway began to vibrate. It was 5:14 a.m. In rural Ohio, mornings are supposed to belong to the morning doves and the slow drip of a coffee maker. But on this Tuesday, the silence was shattered by the brutal, metallic screech of a lowboy trailer scraping against asphalt. Arthur stepped onto his porch, mug in hand, just in time to see the yellow iron of a Caterpillar D8 bulldozer roll off the ramp. There was no knock on the door. There was no reading of a warrant. Within 10 minutes, the diesel smoke choked out the smell of pine, and the steel blade of the machine tore directly through the hand-hewn oak beams of a barn that had stood for 3 generations. By the time the sun fully broke over the horizon, 40 years of history was a pile of splintered kindling. To understand the sheer weight of what was lost in those 90 minutes, you have to understand what that barn represented. This wasn't a derelict, rotting shack used to dump rusted tractor parts. It was a pristine, structurally sound timber frame bank barn, built in 1922, housing 2 classic tractors, thousands of dollars in farming equipment, and decades of family memories. Arthur Vance wasn't a radical or a renegade, he was a retired surveyor who understood land boundaries better than anyone in the county. For months, he had been locked in a quiet, civil zoning dispute with the Regional Development Board over a proposed highway easement. He thought they were playing by the rules of civil procedure. He thought his property was protected by the 14th Amendment. He was entirely wrong. The state didn't send a letter. They sent a demolition crew. The contrast between ordinary citizens and the machinery of bureaucratic power is terrifyingly stark. When you or I have a disagreement with a neighbor, we talk, or we go to small claims court. We file papers, we wait weeks for a hearing, and we abide by due process. But when a government entity decides your property stands in the way of a commercial corridor, the rules change entirely. They don't use persuasion, they use structural violence hidden behind administrative codes. As the bulldozer operator casually lit a cigarette and watched the roof collapse inward, Arthur stood at the perimeter of his own yard, held back by 2 private security guards hired by the contractor. They told him he was trespassing on an active demolition site. His own land. His own memories. The helplessness was suffocating. But the true shockwave of this story didn't happen during the violence of the morning. It happened 12 hours later, when the dust had finally settled and the contractors had packed up their heavy machinery. At precisely 6:42 p.m., just as the sun was dipping below the tree line, a clean, white state-issued Ford Explorer pulled into the driveway. Out stepped a man in a crisp polo shirt, carrying a digital tablet and a manila folder. It was the Chief State Environmental and Building Inspector, Donald Vance, no relation to Arthur, but a man who held the absolute power of the state's administrative pen. He didn't look at the wreckage with remorse. In fact, he didn't look at Arthur at all until he walked right up to the porch steps, clicked his pen, and handed over a document that turned a tragedy into a calculated financial execution. The document wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of a bureaucratic mix-up. It was an emergency administrative citation and an invoice. Under State Revised Code Section 3781, the inspector formally declared the remains of the barn a public health hazard and active nuisance. Because the structure was now collapsed and structurally unstable, ironically, because they had just bulldozed it, the state was exercising its emergency powers to fine Arthur $2,000 per day until the debris was entirely cleared. Furthermore, the manila folder contained a lien notice against Arthur's property for $28,000 to cover the immediate cost of the morning's emergency demolition services. The state hadn't just destroyed his livelihood, they were making him pay for the sledgehammer. This is where the psychological game of high-stakes land disputes becomes clear. The goal of an aggressive municipal action isn't just to take the land, it is to break the property owner's financial and emotional will to fight back. By burying a retired citizen under thousands of dollars in immediate, daily fines, the state forces them into a defensive position where they are too broke to hire an attorney. They want you compliant, panicked, and ready to sign away your deed just to make the nightmare stop. But the inspectors made one critical mistake when they targeted Arthur Vance. They assumed he was just another elderly landowner who would confuse authority with legality. They forgot that as a retired surveyor, Arthur knew exactly how to read between the lines of a property deed, and he knew that every bureaucratic paper trail eventually leaves a footprint. The delivery of the $28,000 invoice on the very day of the demolition was designed to cause immediate, paralyzing panic. For most people, receiving a government document threatening the seizure of their land is enough to make them sign whatever settlement agreement is placed in front of them. The state was banking on that exact reaction. Inspector Donald Vance stood on the porch, waiting for Arthur to yell, to break down, or to plead for an extension. Instead, Arthur did something that caught the inspector completely off guard. He took out his reading glasses, quietly sat down on his porch glider, and began to read the administrative citation line by line, comparing the statutory citations to the land use codes he had memorized over a 40-year career. Arthur's calm exterior hid a furious, analytical mind. As he read the text of State Revised Code Section 3781, he noticed a critical anomaly in the phrasing. The citation claimed the barn was demolished under an imminent public safety hazard exemption, which allowed the county to bypass the standard 30-day written notification and appeals process. According to the document, an anonymous complaint had been filed alleging that the barn's western foundation wall was failing, threatening to collapse onto the public right-of-way of Route 4. But Arthur knew that Route 4 was over 80 feet away from his barn's perimeter. Under the state's own administrative manual, a structure must be within 15 feet of a public thoroughfare to be classified as an imminent hazard to commuters. The state hadn't followed the law, they had stretched it until it broke. When Arthur pointed out the distance discrepancy to Inspector Vance, the official didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he simply tapped his digital tablet, adjusted his sunglasses, and muttered that any factual disputes would have to be settled through an administrative appeal with the County Board of Zoning Appeals, a process that currently had a 6-month backlog. In the meantime, the $2,000 daily fines would continue to accumulate. The message was clear: the truth didn't matter in the short term because the bureaucracy could outweigh and outspend any ordinary citizen. After delivering the warning, the inspector walked back to his vehicle, leaving Arthur alone in the dimming twilight, looking out over the splintered remains of his family's heritage. The next morning, Arthur didn't waste time mourning. He drove straight to the county recorder's office in the basement of the local courthouse. As a retired surveyor, he knew that while politicians and inspectors could lie, public land records, tax assessments, and geographic information system data could not. He spent hours pulling up the parcel maps for his property and the surrounding acreage along the Route 4 corridor. That was when the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. For the past 2 years, a major commercial logistics corporation had been quietly buying up agricultural options along the highway, planning to build a massive 3 million square foot distribution center. The only obstacle standing in the way of their planned 4-lane access road was a half-acre corner of Arthur's property, the exact half-acre where his historic bank barn had stood. The connection between the private logistics company and the sudden emergency demolition became undeniable when Arthur pulled the entity disclosure records for the development corporation. Listing among the principal investors and board members was none other than the brother-in-law of the county commission chairman, the very individual who oversaw the funding for the regional building inspection office. It was a classic, sophisticated eminent domain workaround. If the county tried to seize Arthur's land through traditional eminent domain, they would have to pay him fair market value, undergo a public hearing, and justify the taking in a court of law. But by declaring the barn a hazardous nuisance and demolishing it, they destroyed the property's financial value, burdened the owner with debt, and cleared the path for the logistics road without spending a single dime of taxpayer money on acquisition. Armed with this data, Arthur realized he couldn't fight this battle alone in small claims court. He needed an ally who understood how to turn the state's own bureaucratic machinery against them. He drove to the office of Elena Vance Russo, a sharp, local land use attorney who specialized in defending agricultural property rights against municipal encroachment. When Elena reviewed the emergency citation and the parcel maps Arthur brought her, her expression shifted from professional curiosity to absolute disbelief. She realized that the county had skipped a fundamental constitutional step: they had failed to obtain a judicial warrant before entering the property with heavy machinery. They had relied entirely on an administrative declaration, believing Arthur would never look into the corporate connections behind the order. Elena immediately filed an emergency motion for an injunction in the County Common Pleas Court to freeze the accumulation of the daily fines and prevent the county from clearing the debris. If the county removed the splintered timber, they would be destroying the physical evidence of the barn's structural integrity. She knew that to win a case of this magnitude, they had to prove bad faith on behalf of the state officials. They needed to show that the barn was completely safe before the bulldozers arrived, completely undermining the imminent hazard narrative. The battle lines were drawn. On one side was a multi-million-dollar corporate development backed by compromised county officials, on the other side was a retired surveyor and a local lawyer armed with nothing but public records and the truth. The filing of the emergency injunction hit the county administration building like an unexpected tremor. Within 2 hours of Elena Vance Russo serving the papers to the county legal department, the tone of the conflict shifted from arrogant indifference to calculated damage control. The county's corporate counsel immediately requested an off-the-record meeting in the judge's chambers, hoping to settle the matter quietly before the local media caught wind of a zoning conspiracy. They offered to waive the $28,000 demolition fee and drop the daily $2,000 fines in exchange for Arthur signing a non-disclosure agreement and granting the county a permanent easement across his half-acre for the logistics access road. It was a tempting offer for someone who just wanted their life back, but Arthur knew that a settlement would bury the corruption forever. Arthur turned down the settlement within 30 seconds. He didn't want a compromise, he wanted a public record of the truth. With the injunction successfully granted by the judge, the county was legally prohibited from touching a single splinter of the destroyed barn for 45 days while both sides prepared for an evidentiary hearing. This temporary victory gave Elena and Arthur the window of time they desperately needed to gather physical proof. Elena knew that the county's entire legal defense rested on a single, crucial document, the original inspection report allegedly written by Inspector Donald Vance 48 hours before the demolition occurred. According to state law, an inspector must document specific structural failures with photographic evidence before declaring an emergency hazard. To uncover how that report was generated, Elena used the power of civil discovery to force the county to release the metadata of the digital tablet used by Donald Vance on the week of the demolition. In high-stakes property disputes, metadata is often the ultimate truth-teller. While a corrupt official can easily type out a fraudulent report and backdate it on a piece of paper, a digital file automatically logs the exact GPS coordinates, the time of creation, and the device ID every time a photo is taken or a form is saved. When the county's IT department reluctantly handed over the encrypted data logs under a federal subpoena, Arthur and Elena spent 48 consecutive hours analyzing the system timestamps. What they discovered changed the entire nature of the case from a zoning dispute to a criminal conspiracy. The metadata revealed that Inspector Donald Vance had never actually visited Arthur's property on the date listed in the official report. According to the GPS tracking logs embedded within the tablet's operating system, at the exact hour he claimed to be evaluating the structural integrity of Arthur's timber frame bank barn, his device was pinging from a luxury golf resort 60 miles away, where the Logistics Corporation was hosting a private charity fundraiser. Even more damning, the photographic evidence attached to the state's emergency declaration wasn't even a photo of Arthur's barn. The inspector had used a heavily cropped, low-resolution image of a collapsed barn from a completely different county, taken 3 years prior, and uploaded it into the file to fabricate a public safety crisis. This level of fraud crossed a definitive line, transforming the administrative action into a felony violation of civil rights under color of law. Elena realized that they no longer needed to just defend Arthur's land, they had the ammunition to dismantle the entire regional development board. But they had to act carefully. If they revealed their evidence too early, the county officials would find a way to blame the entire incident on an isolated computer glitch or an administrative oversight by a single rogue employee. They needed to lock the county commissioners into their fraudulent story under oath, in front of a court reporter, where they could not retreat or rewrite the narrative. Elena scheduled a series of video-recorded depositions, calling in the chairman of the county commission, the CEO of the Logistics Corporation, and Inspector Donald Vance one by one. During his deposition, the inspector sat confidently across from Elena, dressed in his formal uniform, completely unaware of the digital trap that had been laid for him. He testified under penalty of perjury that he had personally walked the perimeter of Arthur's barn, observed severe foundation buckling with his own eyes, and felt that public safety was so compromised that waiting for a court order would have put passing motorists in immediate, mortal danger. He even looked directly into the camera and expressed regret that he had to destroy a historic structure, claiming he was simply doing his duty to protect the community. Elena let him speak without interruption, allowing him to elaborate on his fictional inspection for over an hour. She asked him to confirm the exact time of his visit, the weather conditions, and the specific structural elements he analyzed. Donald Vance doubled down on every lie, assuming that a retired surveyor and a small-town lawyer would never have the technical capability to challenge a state-certified digital file system. Once he had firmly committed himself to the timeline, Elena quietly pulled a thick stack of printed documents from her briefcase and slid them across the table. It was the certified GPS metadata report, verified by an independent digital forensics expert, proving his exact location at the golf resort. The color immediately drained from the inspector's face as he realized he had just committed perjury on camera. The silence inside the deposition room was absolute. Inspector Donald Vance stared down at the printouts of his own tablet's metadata, his fingers visibly trembling as he processed the geometric coordinate maps mapping his exact location at the luxury golf resort. His corporate attorney immediately jumped to his feet, shouting an objection and demanding a recess, but the trap had already snapped shut. Under civil procedure rules, the testimony was locked in. The perjury was complete, recorded on high-definition video, and explicitly tied to a fraudulent state document used to violate a citizen's constitutional rights. Elena Vance Russo didn't say a word, she simply smiled, leaned back in her chair, and let the camera capture the panicked whispering between the state official and his legal counsel. The momentum had completely shifted, but Arthur knew that winning a deposition wasn't the same as winning the war. A corrupt administrative system has a remarkable ability to protect itself by sacrificing a lower-level pawn to shield the kingpins. If Donald Vance took the entire fall as a rogue inspector, the county commission and the multi-million-dollar logistics firm would simply distance themselves from him, cancel the access road easement temporarily, and wait for the public scrutiny to blow over before targeting Arthur's property again under a different bureaucratic loophole. Arthur didn't just want his fines wiped out, he wanted a permanent injunction that would protect his family's land forever and expose the financial pipeline linking the politicians to the private developers. To achieve this, Elena didn't wait for the scheduled evidentiary hearing in the backrooms of the courthouse. Instead, she used a powerful but underutilized state procedure. She invoked the right to an emergency public injunction hearing before the full county board of commissioners during their televised monthly public forum. By moving the battleground from a quiet judge's chambers to a crowded public auditorium filled with local farmers, property owners, and news cameras, she stripped the politicians of their ultimate weapon, secrecy. The commissioners tried desperately to postpone the meeting, citing administrative scheduling conflicts, but Elena filed a writ of mandamus, forcing them by law to hold the session or face immediate contempt of court charges. On the night of the hearing, the county auditorium was packed to its absolute capacity. Hundreds of local residents, deeply unnerved by the thought that their own homes or barns could be bulldozed at sunrise without warning, stood along the walls holding signs demanding accountability. Sitting at the long dais at the front of the room were the 5 county commissioners, looking visibly uncomfortable under the bright studio lights of the local press corps. In the center of the room stood Arthur Vance, wearing his best Sunday suit, holding a simple manila folder containing the data that would dismantle the county's commercial corridor project. When the chairman called Arthur's case to the podium, the county's chief legal counsel stood up first, attempting to preempt the presentation. The lawyer offered a public apology on behalf of the county for what he described as an unfortunate clerical error and miscommunication in the Code Enforcement Division. He formally announced that the county was completely withdrawing the $28,000 demolition invoice, canceling all daily fines, and offering Arthur a structural replacement settlement of $150,000 to rebuild a modern steel barn on his property. To the average viewer, it looked like a massive victory for the elderly landowner. The chairman even smiled, tapped his gavel, and asked Arthur if he accepted the county's generous resolution to this unfortunate mistake. Arthur walked up to the microphone, looked the chairman directly in the eye, and spoke clearly into the PA system. He stated that his family's history wasn't for sale, and that what occurred at 5:14 a.m. on his property wasn't an administrative mistake, it was a coordinated, illegal taking executed for private corporate profit. Before the chairman could cut his microphone, Elena flipped a switch on her laptop, projecting the digital metadata maps, the fraudulent barn photos, and the video clip of Inspector Vance's perjury onto the massive screens hanging above the commissioners' heads. The entire auditorium gasped as the clear, undeniable proof of a state-sponsored conspiracy was broadcast live to the county. Elena didn't stop at the inspector's fraud. She brought up the financial disclosure logs she had uncovered, revealing the exact dates when the Logistics Corporation had transferred over $200,000 in consulting fees to a shell company controlled by the chairman's brother-in-law. The timeline was precise. Every time Arthur had rejected a private buyout offer for his half-acre over the past year, a cash transfer was made, followed immediately by an internal directive sent from the Commission's office to the building department ordering an expedited inspection of Arthur's parcel. It was a flawless, devastating presentation of systemic corruption that completely shattered the state's narrative of public safety. The audience roared, forcing the chairman to pound his gavel repeatedly to maintain order, though his face had turned a ghost-white shade of pale. The remaining commissioners, realizing they were sitting on a sinking ship, immediately began to turn on each other on live television, loudly disavowing any personal knowledge of the chairman's private business dealings. Elena demanded an immediate vote on a binding resolution to declare the emergency demolition order completely null and void, to strip the Regional Development Board of its eminent domain powers along the Route 4 corridor, and to refer the entire investigation to the State Attorney General's Public Corruption Unit. The fallout from that public hearing was swift, decisive, and entirely unprecedented in the history of the county. Facing the threat of immediate federal civil rights lawsuits and the undeniable reality of a recorded perjury charge, the remaining county commissioners voted unanimously to strip the chairman of his administrative authority before the television cameras even stopped rolling. Within 48 hours, the State Attorney General's Public Corruption Unit issued formal subpoenas for the hard drives, financial records, and personal cell phones of everyone involved in the Route 4 corridor expansion project. Inspector Donald Vance and the former commission chairman found themselves transitioning from high-powered public officials to criminal defendants, facing multiple felony counts of conspiracy, forgery, and official misconduct under color of law. For Arthur, however, the courtroom victories and the political downfalls were secondary to the reality waiting for him back at the farm. The Sunrise Siege had left a physical and emotional void on his land. A historic landmark that had weathered a century of brutal Midwestern winters, economic depressions, and family milestones was still just a chaotic mound of splintered white oak and twisted tin. But the story of the old surveyor who successfully stood up to the state machine had resonated deeply across the agricultural community. On the first Saturday following the public hearing, before Arthur could even finish brewing his morning coffee, the sound of diesel engines echoed down his driveway once again. Only this time, the machinery didn't belong to state contractors with demolition orders. Dozens of flatbed trailers, pickup trucks, and tractors pulled into the pasture, driven by neighboring farmers, local tradesmen, and total strangers from 3 counties away who had watched the televised hearing. They didn't come to destroy, they came to rebuild. Using the $250,000 punitive damage settlement that Elena had successfully extracted from the Logistics Corporation's insurance bond, a massive community barn raising was organized. Local timber framers volunteered their time to source authentic, rough-sawn white oak beams, using historical mortise and tenon joinery to replicate the exact architecture of the original 1922 structure. By noon, the site of the state's corruption was transformed into an active monument of community solidarity and property rights preservation. By the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the freshly raised timber framework, Arthur stood on his porch exactly where he had stood 12 hours after the demolition. The contrast could not have been more profound. Instead of a corrupt state inspector handing him a fraudulent $28,000 invoice, he was surrounded by friends, neighbors, and family celebrating a historic architectural revival. The multi-million-dollar Logistics Corporation was forced to entirely reroute their planned 4-lane access road, completely bypassing Arthur's land and preserving the integrity of his historic property boundaries forever. The victory sent a powerful, chilling shockwave through municipal zoning boards across the entire state. It proved that the absolute authority of administrative codes is only as powerful as the citizens' willingness to comply. By refusing to panic, analyzing the data, and using the state's own public records as a legal shield, a single retired surveyor exposed a system that relied on intimidation rather than true legality. As Arthur watched the final rafters secured into place against the twilight sky, the message of his struggle was etched permanently into the soil of his farm. A man's property isn't just an asset for corporate expansion, and a citizen's home remains a fortress that even the machinery of the state cannot legally tear down.